If you've been paying attention to my videos this year, you'd know that I'm not the biggest fan of Zanki Zero. In fact, I kinda hate it. It's a real shame too, because I was looking forward to this one as soon as I heard about it. I mean, a new game by the same team as Danganronpa? What could go wrong? As you'll see here, quite a bit. The reviews of this game are kinda mixed to begin with, and from what I can tell, I like this game even less than most of the negative reviews. But you're not here to listen to the fact I don't like this game. You want to know why I don't like it. This is why I hate Zanki Zero. Before we get into some of the more substantial stuff, I'm gonna go over the premise, just because a lot of what I say isn't going to make sense if I don't. The premise of Zanki Zero is pretty out there, even compared to Danganronpa, and I think it's too complicated for its own good. Basically, the world has ended, and there are 8 people who have to survive on an island. Not only do they have to survive, but they're also guided by 2 poorly animated cartoon characters in a mission to explore dungeons and to help restore humanity to its former glory. Speaking of which, each character embodies one of the 7 deadly sins in some way because of tragic events in their past. And to top it all off, all of these characters are clones, and except for Sachika, they all have 13-day life cycles. They start as kids and go through various stages of life before dying on day 13. But once this happens, they can be revived via an arcade machine if they have enough points. That might sound like I just spoiled a bunch of plot points, but no. This is all told to you up front within the first chapter. Even as someone who likes complicated stories, I have to say, this is a bit much for just the premise. I mean, compare this to Danganronpa. Highly elite students get trapped inside a prestigious high school by a robotic teddy bear and are forced to murder someone and get away with it if they want to leave. Yeah, there's plenty of other stuff that happens, but that's all you need to know going in. With Zanki Zero, it feels like they're trying to juggle too many ideas for the story, but we'll get to that in the story segment. I actually want to go over the gameplay first. You'll see why soon enough. The gameplay of Zanki Zero is the part of the game that most people seem to agree isn't the best. I'm not saying you're definitely going to hate the gameplay of Zanki Zero, but you probably will. You have to be a very specific kind of gamer to enjoy this sort of thing. Much like the game's premise, the gameplay feels like it's trying to do way too many things at once. This game is a first-person dungeon crawler. You go through the dungeons, fighting enemies, and leveling up. Sounds simple, right? Well, that's before you factor in the survival mechanics. Honestly, these mechanics are so complicated, I literally had to look up a review of the game just to remember them all. You have to go around the dungeons looking for food to make sure your character's stamina stays up, otherwise they might start losing health. But that's not all. The game even factors in things like a character's stress or how much they have to use the bathroom, and has these elements affect the combat. However, you can use some facilities on your island to help with producing resources, but of course, you have to build and upgrade these using materials you found in the dungeons. There's also a skill point system that ties into everything from the combat to the survival mechanics, and bonuses you can add to your characters based on how they've died in the past to help them survive better. Now, if the sound of all these different mechanics you need to keep track of gets you excited, well then congratulations, you'll probably love this game. I know there are hardcore RPG people like that out there, and I genuinely recommend this game to them. Now, for everyone who either gets stressed out from super complex RPG mechanics, or at least doesn't want to babysit all the survival needs of 8 different characters, there is a solution. The game has 5 different difficulty modes that you can adjust whenever you're at base. They all affect both the toughness of enemies and the harshness of the survival meters. The easiest mode renders the survival meters irrelevant, has no enemies, and has the bosses go down in 1 hit. Now, this sounds great and all, and seeing the bosses die instantly is hilarious, but it's not a silver bullet for the gameplay issues. I should know. I enabled it almost immediately and decided to just watch all the cutscenes online instead. Why? Well, for starters, you still have to deal with tank controls, which isn't a huge deal, but I still find them kind of annoying. The same goes for the characters dying after 13 days, forcing you to go revive them. They aren't necessary to use survival in easy mode, especially since Sachika is immune to the issue, but you still want them alive for dialogue moments. moments. Plus, there are certain areas in dungeons that require all 8 characters to be alive. The issue that made me quit, though, was the dungeons themselves. The layouts are confusing and the puzzles are annoying. They often involve a bunch of buttons that open and close various doors, and considering how spread out the maps are, with some buttons even affecting things on other floors, it's impossible to keep track of what does what and where you're supposed to go. So yeah, you're gonna love the gameplay if you're a hardcore RPG type, but if you're not, it's gonna be absolute hell for you. But with that out of the way, how's the presentation? It's pretty good. Coincidentally, this is the aspect of the game that's most similar to Danganronpa. I mean, just take one look at that intro and you instantly know who made this game. The soundtrack has a similar quality to it. It's the kind of music that really enhances the mood during the dialogue without being too distracting. But once you look it up outside of the game, you instantly recognize the tracks. In other words, they're atmospheric yet memorable, and honestly would feel right at home in a Danganronpa game. The character models also look nice. As a general rule, I almost always prefer sprites over models. If it's a 3D game, obviously you gotta do what you gotta do, but I will never understand why series like Zero Escape, Ace Attorney, or Professor Layton thought it would be a good idea to switch to models. And much like those games, I see no reason the characters need to be 3D here. That being said, however, I think the models in this game look really good. They're all really polished, the character designs themselves are all really memorable and appealing, and the movements are nice too. Really, the way they're presented is the same as in Danganronpa. The only difference is that they use preset movements instead of still images. Mainly because you can't have a model stand still without it looking weird. Also, there's the occasional illustrated story scene, and those look pretty good as well. The menus look pretty good too. They're nice and clean and add to the game's look. The environments and enemies are definitely the weakest part of the game's visuals, but I wouldn't call them bad. They're just kind of eh. So finally, we come to the story. I wanted to save this part for last because this is the part that everyone praises the most. Your average review of the game will probably say that the gameplay sucks, but the story makes things worth it. It really doesn't. Just so you know, I'll be going in depth here, so I'll let you know when the spoilers start. The story follows a pretty consistent formula for the first 6 chapters. Each chapter has you playing as a different character. They briefly start off on their own before meeting up with the others. The gang manages to install a new function on the Extend machine, and then Extend TV comes on, notifying everyone that some new ruins have appeared. They go through the dungeon and encounter various TVs that have shown Mirai play a conquest video. These conquest videos tell bits and pieces of a backstory for the character you're playing as, showing how they connect to their deadly sin, and the boss is a character from that backstory. Then, after beating the boss, the gang heads home to reflect on what they learned and call it a night. Some other things may happen over the course of the chapter, but that's the general gist of it. Now, this formula has a complicated impact on the game's story. There are some ways it really helps, and other ways it really hurts. And a lot of this has to do with the game's characters. The characters in Zanki Zero are a mixed bag. I don't mean I like some of them and hate the others, I actually like the main 8 about equally. It's more so the way they're handled. The best way to sum up the issue is that the game is great at developing the characters on an individual level, but pretty bad at doing it on a group level. Let me explain. Having each chapter be from the perspective of a different character is a really good idea. The narration gives you a great idea of who the character is. Yeah, you kind of already knew their personality from interacting with them, but getting inside their head gives you a much better idea of their personality and motivation. Plus, it makes for a lot of interesting reveals with characters having completely different sides to them or hiding things from the group. However, like I said, the game's formula really impedes character development too. Simply put, aside from the prologue in Chapter 1, we don't get to see the characters interacting with each other much. There are a few moments in each dungeon where they'll pause to talk to each other, and these moments are good, but they're also few, far between, and pretty short. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about the other moments, like the beginning and end of the chapter? Well, the problem with that is it's basically just business. It's just the characters speculating about what's going on with the island, or discussing what they need to do next. You never really see them bonding during downtime. The sad part is, they almost got this right. The prologue in Chapter 1 had scenes of the gang just sitting by the campfire and talking. Granted, there's still discussion about their current situation, but it's not done in such a dry, straightforward way. Characters argue with each other, laugh with each other, and overall, their personalities really shine through. In other words, the scenes aren't there for the sole purpose of moving the plot forward. forward. They also serve to give the characters a bit of breathing room, and frankly, I feel like the game needed more moments like that, because as a general rule, if you're not playing as a character, you're not gonna get much out of them in that chapter. By the time I had watched through all of the cutscenes, the only characters I felt like I got to know were Sho and Mirai, who are essentially this game's Monokuma. Now, there are optional bonding events where two characters will relax with each other, so maybe it's my fault for not watching them. After all, this does seem like the kind of thing I was asking for. My response is that I shouldn't have to seek out optional content in a game with this much story just so I can feel like I got to know the characters. And I especially shouldn't have to do this in a game from the team behind Danganronpa. In the Danganronpa games, despite having double the characters to flesh out and not having the advantage of telling the story from their perspective, the story was structured in such a way I felt like I got to know each character without the free time events. True, that was also a visual novel, while this has more gameplay it has to cram in, but that shouldn't matter given the advantages I just listed. Like I said at the beginning of this segment, each character is great in their own chapter, but it also feels like they're on an island, a metaphorical one, not just the literal island they're on. It's them and everyone else is an afterthought. The one other issue I have in the character department is how the aging gimmick screws with the character moments. I can't be the only one who finds it distracting when there's a big group discussion where some of the characters look like children and others look like senior citizens, but mentally they're still young adults. I get that this is a necessary side effect of the aging gimmick, but that just raises the question, why have the aging gimmick? For the most part, the only role it plays in the story is giving the characters an incentive to listen to Sho and Mirai, but they had plenty of incentives to do that anyway, and the other plot points involving it could just as easily be adjusted. And as for the gameplay, I think this game would survive with one less gimmick thrown on the pile. Now that I'm done with the characters, time for more general story stuff. This is where I'm going to throw up that spoiler warning, by the way. Let's start with the most prevalent blunder in the game's story, the conquest videos. The game's whole gimmick of linking characters to the 7 deadly sins hinged entirely on these videos, and I gotta say, they screwed it up pretty badly. You see, especially given the reviews that praise this game for how dark it can be, you would expect this to be like The Cave, where each character has done some terrible things to link them to each sin. Well, that's not at all what happens here. Haruto's story is the best case study to show where these videos went wrong. He worked as a brand new editor for a newspaper and did a story on women in poverty. For the article, he did an interview with the woman who asks that her photos and personal information aren't published in the paper. Haruto agrees not to publish the pictures that were already taken, but his boss demands that they show her face because he thinks it would sell more papers. The picture gets published and the woman winds up dying as a result. Now, I was expecting Haruto to cave to his boss's demands, but no, it turns out he refused and the boss published the photos anyway, and Haruto gets branded with the sin of sloth for not deleting the pictures before his boss could get to them, because clearly that's something he should have accounted for in his first article. So, you notice any problems? Well, there's 2 of them that extend to all of the other videos. For starters, the connection to the sin is a real stretch. While there are a few characters like Zen and Minamo who actually commit their deadly sin, and even then Minamo is kind of debatable, Haruto and Rinko's connections to their sin are tenuous at best, and Yuma and Ryo weren't even the ones doing their sin. It was someone else in their story doing it. The other issue is that despite these characters being linked to one of the 7 deadly sins, none of them, even the ones who have done genuinely awful things, were the villain of their story. I guess that second one isn't necessarily a problem, but when you make a big deal about the characters being linked to the 7 deadly sins, you would expect them to be morally ambiguous at least, and have to cope with their past mistakes. But no, Mamoru and Zen are the only ones who really did anything wrong. Oh, and it gets acknowledged in Chapter 7 that the 7 deadly sins connections are kinda pointless, because that's a great thing to put in your game, right? Have one of the main elements of the premise be completely meaningless. The other thing I want to talk about with the Conquest videos is how dark they are. I remember seeing reviews hyping up how this game was much darker than Danganronpa, and I gotta say, I'm disappointed. Zen's was kind of unsettling, and Yuma's was decently disturbing, but with the others, the worst part was the anticipation. I guess it's partially due to being primed by the reviews, but my brain spent so much time filling in the blanks with what I thought would happen in these stories. They seemed super tame because I was expecting something way worse. It's not that they don't deal with dark subject matter. Honestly, I picked Haruto's story because reading off most of the others would probably lead to an Angus Bumby situation. The problem is, due to the way the stories are presented, they're just disturbing ideas. You feel so far removed from the experience, it feels like fishing around your brain for something comically screwed up and saying, yeah, that happened to this character. The end. Compare this to Danganronpa Ultra Despair Girls, where, for the most part, they don't even tell you what happened to the Warriors of Hope, at least not directly, but their reactions, facades they put up, and clear bouts of PTSD paint a much more visceral picture than anything in these videos. The closest we get to that in this game is Zen, who runs ahead of the group and sets off the TVs before they can catch up, not wanting his friends to see the shameful things he's done. And even then, that's nowhere near as bad as anything in Ultra Despair Girls. Really, between Ultra Despair Girls doing something similar but more visceral, and mainline Danganronpa being a series where basically any character can die at any moment, I don't get why people were talking up how dark this game is. Maybe because it's more down-to-earth than Danganronpa character-wise, but that's really not saying much. Especially since this game is way crazier than Danganronpa when it comes to basically everything else. Aside from the Conquest videos, the mystery about everything that's going on is pretty well presented. The conclusions the gang comes to make sense, there are some good red herrings in there, and new information gets fed to you at a satisfying pace. Although some of the reveals are kinda lame. Like, at the end of Chapter 5, there's a supposedly big reveal about the creatures you're fighting, and I'm just left thinking, does this matter? Why are you telling me this? Does it really change anything? And that leads into my next point. No matter how well set up a mystery is, a disappointing answer can ruin it. How does Zanki Zero do in this department? It's a mixed bag. Most of the answers come in Chapter 7 when Mamoru is revealed to be a traitor. Now, I ranted in an earlier video about how stupid it was that he teamed up with Kurosuke, and earlier in this video, I complained about the 7 Deadly Sins gimmick being meaningless, both of which are revealed in this chapter. However, aside from those two things, Mamoru's backstory is fantastic. It's tragic, but doesn't try too hard to be edgy. It makes you feel for him, and answers a lot of questions in a satisfying way. Honestly, remembering how good his backstory was compared to the other characters kinda makes me feel bad for putting him in least favorite characters. Then we get to Chapter 8, and oh boy do things go off the rails. It's a shame too, because the setup was great. There's only one character left, Sachika. The ominously named Girl of Original Sin has had more mystery surrounding her than anyone else in the game. Most of these questions were answered in Chapter 7, but there's still the matter of her surprise dark side foreshadowed early on, and the fact that she apparently has multiple personalities now. So, we'll learn a lot by playing as her, right? Nope, we're playing as Haruto again. Also, at the beginning of the chapter, Kurosuke talks to Haruto in his dreams, since Haruto's memories were saved over Kurosuke's X-Key, essentially having him take over Kurosuke's consciousness. Kurosuke makes a big deal about shaming Haruto, and talks about the darkness in Haruto overtaking him. Oh, so does Haruto have some big moral conflict in this chapter? Does he do something seriously questionable? Well, kind of, but the game doesn't really view it that way. This conversation never comes up again, and is entirely pointless. Okay, that's 2 big disappointments already, but the chapter is still salvageable. After all, the lab that was used to turn everyone into clones just washed up on shore. What secrets could be inside? Well, it gets revealed that Dr. Terashima, the man responsible for creating the clones, has been alive the whole time as an AI. Now, it was kind of obvious that he was going to play a larger role in the story, given how much focus he was given in Mamoru's backstory, and the fact that he's the only other character they bothered to make a model for. What I wasn't expecting was for him to be hiding in Sachika's prosthetic arm and mind-controlling her to create the illusion of a split personality. I'll admit, I was a bit disappointed that Sachika herself didn't have some terrible secret she was hiding, but I think a lot of that is me being disappointed with the whole 7 Deadly Sins gimmick. Besides, this is pretty similar, and seeing Dr. Terashima talk as a robotic arm is pretty hilarious. Also, Dr. Terashima himself is easily the best character in the game. Despite only really appearing in the last 2 chapters and a brief cameo in Chapter 4, he managed to make a bigger impression on me than any of the main characters. He's so eccentric, and everything from his personality, to his voice, to his design and mannerisms just makes me smile. Also, seeing him creepily insert himself into Extend TV is pretty hilarious. Speaking of which, his Extend TV segments make make it pretty damn clear he's the final boss, and when you get to him, things go off the rails even further. First off, it gets revealed that the original Extend machine is made out of Dr. Tereshima's wife. Like, as in she gave up her life and her organs are now part of the machine. Why? Like, I get the in-universe reason, but why would you make this a twist? It's funny that this game tries to act more down-to-earth than Danganronpa, because as crazy as Danganronpa is, there's no way they would have done something this stupid. It's not even a big part of the plot either. It's a completely pointless twist. Seriously, out of all of the games to take inspiration from, why would you pick the universally mocked Bionic Commando reboot? Anyway, Dr. Terashima says he'll fix the aging effect by having the gang be reborn alongside his ideal version of humanity. A new human race that doesn't do things like murder people or any of the crap in the Conquest videos. He also mentions that he caused the apocalypse, even though he didn't mean to. He only meant to kill the people in his lab to do research on the effects. That reveal may seem contrived, but I can honestly buy Dr. Terashima being the kind of guy who wouldn't see why that's a big deal. Of course, this turns everyone against him, and they fight him as the final boss. However, first you have to fight Sho and Mirai, and I don't know how it is from a gameplay perspective, but I really like it from a story point of view. It's a clever send-off, and Sho and Mirai's final words were arguably the most emotional moments in the game, because, like I said, it felt like they were more developed than any of the main characters. Anyway, you fight Terashima, beat him, and he impales Sachika through the X key. So not only does she die, but now there's no way to bring her back. However, just when all seems lost, a lone baby rises up from the liquid in the floor, and the gang decides to raise her, and I guess that means this is a happy ending? This ending seriously pissed me off. The main reason is that the gang killing Terashima is monumentally stupid. He may be a terrible guy, but it's made abundantly clear that going along with his plan is the only way to restore anything resembling humanity. Seriously, out of the 8 of them, Sachika is the only one capable of having children because the others have the aging effect. Also, they flat out say at the beginning of the chapter that even if the aging effect was removed, there's still no way they could repopulate the Earth. I get that replacing humanity with a supposedly perfect new species is a common villain trope, but stopping a plan like that isn't a noble goal when humanity is basically already extinct. So yeah, the goal of the game was to restore humanity, but instead it'll go extinct because of the main characters. But don't worry, they're justified, because the guy trying to restore humanity was a bad person. And you don't want to give a bad person what they want, even if it'll lead to something positive overall. Besides, we have a non-clone baby now, so there's hope, I guess. I swear, this game clearly wants to say something about cloning, but it's impossible to tell what. Is it bad because it's treated as unnatural and caused the apocalypse? Well then why is it the only thing that's been keeping the gang alive and the only reason they survived the apocalypse? Also, the disaster only spread worldwide because of anti-clone activists. It's like they want to say cloning's bad, but they constantly show it being good. Anyway, yeah, whatever positive feelings I had towards this game's story were completely ripped away by that ending. So those are my thoughts on Zanki Zero. You may have noticed I'm not calling this a review, and there's a reason for that. I didn't finish the game. I didn't even finish Chapter 1 using the normal difficulty, and I stopped playing altogether and just watched the cutscenes online after finishing Chapter 3. So I don't think I can adequately judge the game enough to call this a full review. I gave the game credit where I felt it deserved it, partially because I really wanted to like it, but at the end of the day, I couldn't stand it. The game is borderline unplayable unless you're really into survival RPGs, and the mode meant to eliminate the gameplay problems is still tedious and frustrating. Now, I expected the gameplay to suck. Most of the reviews indicated that, but the story, which they all said was the reason to play this game, is what really let me down. The characters are underdeveloped, the game deals with too many concepts, leading to them being pointless at best or impediments to the story at worst. The game somehow manages to be too dark and not dark enough at the same time, a lot of the big questions of unsatisfying answers, and that ending feels like a slap in the face. I am Defawfalizer, and that's why I hate Zanki Zero.